Welcome to the program. My guest is Wyatt Andrews. Wyatt is an Emmy award-winning journalist, the former national correspondent for the CBS Evening News. Wyatt, thank you for being here, sir.
Coy, thanks for the invitation.
Very glad you're here.
Thanks.
So we'll talk about journalism. I want to talk about, television and of course Trump. And let's begin there. I want to begin with the headlines that we've seen over the last year, beginning in the campaign, where Donald Trump was literally going after journalists. And of course, politicians in America, since George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, they've always gone after journalists. But in a way, we saw something new for the modern age, at least publicly, a real vicious anger towards not just journalism, but journalists and individual reporters.
Right.
As all of that was going on and continues to go on, what crosses your mind, Wyatt?
Well, the outrage of it. The outrage of it. I mean, because as you and I are taping this, we're several weeks into the administration. Back when he was the campaigner, Donald Trump, you could be invited to see all the attacks on the dishonest press and the dishonest media as standard Republican primary fare. But I can tell you, I know a lot of people who covered Trump day to day, and so they would be in the pen,
right? At these rallies,
at the Trump rallies, and that's typically 50 yards, depending on the size of the arena, to roughly that, 50 yards back from where he's speaking, with a lot of people in between, and the number of times that he would point out and say, the dishonest media back there, they will never, point out the size of our crowds. That was a typical standard fare from him. But there was a vituperativeness to this. There was a meanness to this. Every reporter that I spoke to that covered him, would tell me, Wyatt, this is different. He is stoking anger, real anger directed at us, to the point where reporters, for the first time that I've ever recalled, were hiring security to accompany them to Trump rallies. And to add, and Coy, to add to the outrage there is the fact that many people commented on the size of his rallies. It was nonsense.
It was reported frequently.
He was saying. And the whole thing that you would point at very hard-working, ethical reporters trying to do their job and say, right there, folks, is the dishonest media, that is disgraceful, because reporters, the public doesn't know this, but the mainstream media in general, the reporters who are in the mainstream media, are among the most ethical, honest, hardest working, and bravest reporters out there. I mean, it is just, if one of the problems with the media, let's just speak the truth here. One of the problems with the media is that they frequently get stories wrong, all right? But most people in the mainstream media work under a code of ethics that gets them fired if they are purposefully wrong. So it is flat out incorrect, and he knows it. It's incorrect to label the entire media as dishonest, and there was an agenda to it that you would think in the campaign, you thought, this is a little weirder than before, but it's standard.
Yeah, it's just campaign politics.
That was campaigner Donald Trump.
Right.
Now we're seeing the president, Donald Trump, doing the same thing, and I believe it has got to stop, and people need to understand that this is a fundamentally dishonest thing to say. It is a tactic that can only harm the republic. Because it is the press's job to question the president. If reporters get something wrong and are called out for it, they need to correct it, but they are not, in general, dishonest.
Yeah.
Period.
And we see his same approach over the last few days to the judicial branch. So-called judges. I mean, it's a bully's tactic. If you don't agree with me, if you don't repeat what I'm saying as truth, then I'm going to attack you as a liar, as disgraceful, as somebody who's just playing politics, whatever words happen to come to his mouth. He's doing to the judicial branch of government what he's been doing to the Fourth Estate, to the free press.
And that tactic always worked for him as a businessman. I mean,
exactly.
That's kind of a billionaire business tactic 101.
Right.
Go nuclear at all times. I mean, he's always said that he's this counterpuncher, right? And he always proved that in his business. If you opposed him, he went after you hard, personally, business-wise, and whatever. And the negotiating tactic there is, somebody told me this about reporting in Russia. This is a funny anecdote, and it's generally how you negotiate with a Russian. You go up to him and you embed your thumbs deeply in your Russian counterpart's eyes, right? And then you say, let's discuss what you give up in order for me to remove my thumbs from your eyes.
Right.
And it's a hilarious line, but it's also the basis of negotiation. You set thresholds, that are unattainable and make your opponent or your negotiating opponent dial back from there. But you can't govern that way. This is the issue. And I approach the way I teach our students and the way I view Mr. Trump. Coy, I cannot bring myself right now, 2 weeks into his presidency, I can't bring myself as a citizen to hope that he fails. But I hope that he changes his behavior. Because you can't, even if you presume that President Trump has a mandate to go and disrupt Washington, to blow up Washington, and I do think you have to respect that that's what these 63 million voters were saying when they elected him in this surprise
in so many ways
election.
An anti-establishment vote.
Right.
Yeah.
So he feels like he does have the mandate, and there is some legitimacy to that we have to recognize. But even if you believe that, then even his own supporters, I don't care what party you are, especially his supporters, have an interest in him governing effectively. At some point, he's going to run out of people to insult. And we can get into this a little more deeply, but for example, what happens when President Trump really goes to the Hill for his agenda? He's promised not to touch Medicare or Social Security. That's Paul Ryan's #1 issue, entitlement reform.
Right.
For most, what happens when he really takes on the Tea Party or the Freedom Caucus in Congress, which doesn't want to borrow one more dime from China, not one more dime to the deficit, when independent experts have already said that Trump's tax proposal is going to cost, I think the latest I saw was $2.6 trillion over 10 years. What happened? Is he going to insult his way through Congress and think that he's going to be successful as a governing president? So, I think even his supporters have a stake in him figuring out that governing by insult won't work. And governing by insult drives wedges between people.
Yeah.
And he
which,
has
as
to,
you
and
point
he,
out, always served him well as a businessman,
right,
working with bankers and investors, but isn't necessarily the tactic you want when you're dealing with the federal government.
When, I've just covered this too many times. Up on Capitol Hill, do Republicans feel indebted to Donald Trump? Yes, they do. But that's only going to go so far. They got elected, the Freedom Caucus, the Tea Party caucus feel like they got elected for a reason, and that hasn't gone away. And when all his proposals go up there, he's going to need friends. And even if you are a Donald Trump supporter, this is my point, there are so many Americans who are sitting back there, I know this because I've seen him interviewed on TV, they're wondering, I thought he was going to be presidential. I thought he was going to change.
Yeah.
You hear what I'm saying there?
I do. We still have the campaigner
right
in the White House.
So this idea that he is coming into office, trashing the news media, trashing the judges that are trying to do their best,
trashing our allies around the world,
trashing our allies. My fear on his behalf is that he's going to find that that's not going to last very long. As a tactic, as a successful tactic, it's not going to last very long.
Wyatt, how should we understand the whole alternative fact, this post-truth era? It truly is, as part of his tactics, not just to attack individuals or to attack judges or the press or attack anyone who disagrees with him, but to attack the very idea of truth and to almost push people to a place where they shrug their shoulders and say, well, I guess reality is just up for interpretation. And we should point out, as I do often as I can, that that was one of the great takeaways from Hannah Arendt's work of the origins of totalitarianism. And her study of the fascists of Europe in the 20s and 30s was one of the things they did the most, was attack not just things journalists were saying, but was assault the very idea that there was a truth out there.
Well, you're on to something in that question, and if I might, let me refer back to your last question, because you referred specifically to the trashing of the independent judiciary and the trashing of the independent media, which I argue is overwhelmingly honest. And I guess I hope we can get to that later in this interview. But I was the resident correspondent in Moscow in the 80s when it was still the totalitarian Soviet Union. And I could go around the world with you, but Saudi Arabia would be an example, Egypt under Mubarak, China to this day. I mean, I have physically reported in places that are ruled by autocrats, dictators, and not benevolent monarchies. And this is out of the playbook of how autocrats stay in power. It's out of the playbook for what Erdogan is doing right now in Turkey.
Yeah.
You question the legitimacy of the judiciary. You question the legitimacy of the press. This is all of a piece in which you want to create an atmosphere in which fearless leader cannot be challenged. That's why I said earlier in this interview that what he's doing with respect to the press is a threat to the republic. It's a threat to the idea that the framers of the Bill of Rights enshrined a free press in the Constitution, not because they loved the media, not because they loved newspapers. Jefferson came to hate the newspapers, but they understood that free information in the hands of the people, in this case through the proxy of the press, was the key protection against a tyrant coming back. The key protection against the king being reinstalled in the United States.
They created those fail-safes that institutions, let's say, public education, a free press, an independent judiciary, that would act as firewalls against a demagogue.
Right. And so the embrace, to get to your second question, the embrace of false narratives, and in many cases outright lies designed to deceive the public, is of that same piece. He wants to create an alternate reality in which he can govern on his impressions, govern on his worldview, and when the press pushes back, this isn't factual. Not just, this might not be a good idea, but too much of what you're saying is not factual, he's able to delegitimize them and say, they have no credibility, you're fake news. He's a guy who is adopting the whole agenda of the fake news crowd and then attempting to turn it against the media to say, no, you guys are the fake news. And if you can control the facts, you can create an alternate reality that gives you more freedom to do
And
your
like
thing.
any autocrat, what you end up doing is you end up crippling those institutions that were created to preserve the ideals that we like to say we believe in.
Right.
Democracy, justice, opportunity. You become the one controller who decides how much of your ideas will be realized.
You know what's interesting too, Coy, is that Donald Trump's sister is a federal court judge.
Yeah.
Think about, I'm serious, think about that.
Right.
Think about that for a second. He knows his sister is an honorable judge doing her best to independently implement the Constitution. He knows better. That's a sign that he's doing this on purpose. He's doing this tactically, strategically. He wants to create this place where anybody who comes up against him is delegitimized.
It's also interesting to point out, and then I want to take a quick break, but it's also interesting to point out that right out of the gate, he's not going to Capitol Hill with plans and ideas and building coalitions. He's ruling. He's just a series of executive orders, like a king.
Right. Tick tock, matter of time.
Right.
Matter of time. I mean, they are working on the repeal and replace aspect of Obamacare. The Republicans are.
Yeah.
You know, just now they're trying to say, okay, well, you know what? Maybe we need to actually write the replacement to Obamacare.
Right.
See what it costs.
Maybe we
see how
should
that
replace
would work.
it with something.
So, his legislative proposals are percolating. But you're right. So far, as we tape this, it's all executive orders.
Yeah. Let's take a very quick break. We're talking with Wyatt Andrews, former national correspondent for the CBS News Stay with me. We'll be right back. Welcome back. My guest is Wyatt Andrews. Wyatt is an Emmy Award-winning journalist who for many years was the national correspondent for CBS News. He is now teaching in the Department of Media Studies at the University of Virginia. Wyatt, you brought up a point earlier in the conversation about the extent to which Donald Trump is really capitalizing on a known weak spot in the media.
Right.
And that's the point where there's so millions of Americans who think, well, the media are all biased.
Right.
And they all have a political axe to grind. And I'm going to find the one that I think is telling the truth, and I'm going to listen to them. And all the others are liars. What should we understand about that dynamic from somebody who has spent their whole career on the inside of this journalism beast? You know, are people honest?
Yeah, overwhelmingly honest. Yes, and you can look, excuse me, you can look back at the spectacular failures within the mainstream media. I'm talking about Jason Blair. Yeah. I'm talking about
Stephen Glass. Yeah.
Stephen Glass, exactly right. I'm talking about my own boss, former boss, Dan Rather, where he stretched some of the facts in a very explosive story about former President Bush. Brian Williams exaggerating his experiences in the Iraq War. And I get asked that question a lot. But Stephen Glass and Jason Blair go back more than 10 years. Dan Rather was 12 years ago. Brian Williams was 2 years ago. But think about what they all have in common. Every one of them got fired because they violated the standard of ethics. Right? They violated the dictum that all mainstream media operate under, which is you may not be purposely wrong or you're out of here. And what I really want, and I never understood, I never wrapped my head around, I'm happy to admit this, why we in the mainstream media, when I worked there, were day after day losing the trust of the American people. All across newspapers, the television network that I worked for, we were baffled by this. We'd show up thinking we were doing God's work every day, and our trust factor would lower year by year. So here is what I teach to my students, and what I think the public does not understand, is that we're in this cacophony of news. News is everywhere. It's on all these websites. But where news comes from, and Troy, you've been an on-the-ground, let's talk about legwork reporters like you do sometimes. The guy who is on the phone, the guy who is talking to real people, going to the courthouse, looking at public documents, the guy who has sources in the national intelligence community. I mean, those are the real reporters. Overwhelmingly, most of them work at the biggest newspapers. And if you'll allow me, hear me out, a lot of people don't know this. The New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, and the Los Angeles Times, those five, plus the wire services, Associated Press and Reuters, the original legwork reporters at those institutions produce almost everything in the low to high 90s of everything we read on the internet everywhere. I'm telling you because I was there. If it wasn't for the agencies that I just named, Fox News, CBS News wouldn't have anything to talk about. Everybody in the news business, from bloggers,
because they're reading those papers.
because they're reading those newspapers. Yeah. They are. Fox made $1.5 billion last year, but only has a handful of reporters on the phone. So the pattern is that the New York Times breaks the Clinton email story, right? Think about that. Fox made the $1 billion, but they don't have the reporters
doing the work,
the legwork reporters that do that.
Finding the stories.
That came from the New York Times. And then Fox was able to run with it, and Fox was able to put its own spin with it, but they're reading the New York Times just like everyone else.
And they have a correspondent standing up in Washington and New York saying, the New York Times is reporting, and then they go to a series of shows where people just scream and yell at each other about that story.
Exactly right. So the number of, and those institutions that I just named, and let's expand out to, and let's include Fox, let's include all the cable networks and all the broadcast networks. They have some reporters that do original reporting. I'm not trashing all of it, but I'm telling you, what I teach my students, and I'm right about this, is that most of the people who write the original story are overwhelmingly honest. And it is the other folks who derive that, who basically take it. Maybe they're subscribers to the Associated Press, so they're taking it legitimately. And they put their different spins on the story.
Right.
But the people who write the original stories can be fired for being purposefully wrong. That's not true at places like Fox News, not true on the alt-right like Breitbart. They get to be wrong on purpose. And why anyone in the public trusts them over the mainstream original reporters, I think, is a function of the public not understanding that. Ultimately, 90% of our news comes from those newspapers.
I remember when I was doing reporting for CNN during the Hannah Graham story, and I did this one time. I agreed to do this talk show with one of those ones where all the people are screaming, and I was the one journalist in there sort of throwing in the facts. I was shocked, Wyatt, at the extent to which the people in that conversation literally knew nothing about what we were talking about. They had glanced at a few websites before they went on the show, and they weren't just wrong, they were way wrong.
Got it.
So I spent the whole time saying, well, and I was on the phone, well, wait a minute, that's not right. And it was so frustrating. I told him, I said, look, I'll do the show where you interview me about what I've learned and what I spent the day out there talking to people, gathering information. But I'm not going to do one of those shows where people are throwing stuff around and they don't really care if it's true.
Here's an exercise that I ask of my students. I ask them where their news comes from, and they will say, certain subscription services. There's a really popular one called The Skim. But let's take any website that any member of your audience, uses for news, and this will apply. Drill into, if you want to protect yourself against fake news, by the way, this is also an exercise that applies to that. Ask yourself if what you are reading online has a byline, and whether it was written by a reporter working for, let's say, BuzzFeed or Vox.com, something like that. Who actually wrote this story? And you will be shocked at the number of times that what you think is, say, a story on FoxNews.com or Vox.com actually came from the Associated Press. When I ask these students, where did that Skim story come from, they'll say, The Skim. And I'll say, no, there's a hyperlink. Click on that. They'll click on that, Reuters. Click on the next one, Washington Post. I'm telling you, one of the reasons that I am so concerned about this is that the honest, ethical reporters who are doing most of the reporting, as a quick aside, do they get stuff wrong? All the time, just not on purpose. And when they get stuff wrong, they're obliged to correct it.
Immediately.
Yes.
As soon as they know. Yeah. You mentioned your students. What do you tell your students, the ones that come to you who really want to be journalists? They were like you or me. They just had that calling. There was something about it that was calling into them that it just seemed like this is absolutely what I want to do. Because for whatever reason, maybe, like you and me, they connected the dots between this work and what America is all about. And those principles and making an effort every day to preserve and strengthen the principles that we're supposed to be believing in and fighting for. What do you tell them?
Well, interestingly, I call it exactly as you described. Real journalism, real reporting is a calling, because because of what I just said. You're checking in with multiple pieces. You walk in the morning with the mandate to never be wrong. Your story can be incomplete, but you can't be wrong. Right? You know that as you walk in the door. So it's really hard. It's a kind of job that is like being a doctor, I guess, in that it's so hard if you don't really love it and you don't feel called to it, on the level that you're describing. it's going to be drudgery. You know, you're going to hate your life.
Right.
So the real reporters that I worked with all felt the calling that you described. And so I tell my students, if that's you, if you feel that calling, then get on board.
Right,
I'll teach you how to do it right. I mean, look, we're the University of Virginia. There is, every day in all the mainstream media that the people don't trust, there is reporting all the time that's superb. It is ethically derived, it's meticulously researched, it's fairly reported. As they contact as many points of view as they possibly can, and on its best days, it calls some public official to account. Going back, again, what Jefferson and Madison had
Speak
in
truth
mind,
to power.
right? And so it's very, very hard to do that. And I tell them, if that's you, you know, if you can, let me back up just one second. And so those pillars that I just named, that's what we're teaching in UVA journalism. There is a right way to do this. If later on after you graduate you have to work for an outfit that doesn't have standards that high, that's going to be the market at the time. But if you're called to this, here's how we're teaching you how the best journalism is done. Another thing to mention, Coy, keep in mind that last I checked, the news business, most of American news is paid for by advertising. And that's still somewhere, depending on how you count it, a $25 billion to $50 billion industry. All right, so that's not going anywhere. News reporting is being redistributed. As all those newspapers and almost everyone moves online, acquires video assets, you know the trend lines.
It's doing what journalism has always done with new technology. It's changing and evolving.
It's adopted it. But that core skill, and in other words, of calling people, reporting fairly, that's not going away. And what I tell the students is it going to be tougher on your watch? Yes. But are the best people going to get jobs? Also yes. It's just going to be in a different environment. Keep going is what I tell them.
Wyatt, thank you for being here. And thank you for the work you do.
Thank you.
Wyatt Andrews is an Emmy Award-winning journalist, former national correspondent for CBS News. He now teaches journalism and media at the University of Virginia. You can find the complete archive of this program online at mediaandcitizenship.org. Y'all have a terrific week and be good to each other.